Today I'm having a look at the Lumenier 3040 triblade. It sure looks fancy. Any luck that we'll have a good competitor to the RotorX? These tests I'm running on an RCX 1407 3800 kV motor on 3S to put them in this similar kind of power range as my previous run-ups. First off, it weighs about 2.2 grams, so that is twice the weight of the RotorX prop, which is unfortunate. It's not super heavy, but obviously that big hub in the middle is not doing us any favors. Thankfully, if that is where most of the mass is distributed, that's a better place for it to be than having thick, heavy blades. And very encouragingly, looking at the thrust results, it is almost, not quite up to the thrust of the RotorX, but we're within just a couple of grams all the way through. Sags a little in the mid band and on the higher end, but our peak thrust on this test is about 306 grams of thrust on the Lumenier prop versus 311 on the RotorX. So only 6 grams of thrust down and staying fairly close throughout the entire test range. It is really looking really good. If we look at the thrust over RPM, we can see that the Lumenier is making less thrust at each particular RPM, but we're reaching a higher top RPM in the test. So obviously we have a lower load on the motor compared to the RotorX, and given we get again just right up to almost exactly the same amount of thrust. So no real surprises in the kind of power curve of the prop over a range of RPMs. And then shown just the RPM recorded over the course of the test, you can see there better the gap of RPM that we see. 30,000 RPM on the RotorX, 31,200 on the Lumenier. So about 1,000 RPM more on the high end. But what this is showing is we're getting the same thrust, and we have a lower load on the motor, which is allowing it to spin faster. So what does that do for our efficiency? Actually, it's really nice. Here again on this chart, the further to the right, the worse the efficiency is. And so throughout this power band, the Lumenier is beating out the RotorX prop just very marginally. So like if we look at our kind of 100 watt scale, we're doing 232 grams of thrust for 100 watts, so 2.3 grams per watt on the RotorX, and our Lumenier is giving us about 2.4 grams per watt, so just 0.1 grams per watt more. But it doesn't seem to come at any drawbacks. We're getting basically the same thrust. We get a teeny bit more efficiency out of it. So this is a really good looking competitor. Hopefully it'll stand up well to normal flight abuse. But if it can, this looks like a really neat prop to try. It's slightly cheaper. We're getting the same power, better efficiency. This looks like a real winner on the bench at least. And just to pop back to the tail end of that RPM chart, just to see if we can notice anything maybe by the weight. Luckily, these two tests seem to exactly have started braking at the same point, so we don't have to make any guesses about where they line up. And it does look like the Lumenier here in red is braking slightly slower than the RotorX, which is half of its weight. So down here at about, say, the 10,000 RPM, this is a gap of just about 10 milliseconds, 10 to 12 milliseconds or so between these 2 points. So up here, this is, maybe 5 milliseconds or something like that. Just a bit of a gap at the top. So it is giving us a result that's big enough that we can kind of see it here. So it's not completely insignificant. But this is a lot smaller than even the difference between two motors that you may find, like when we were looking at the 1105 versus the 1304. That was a much bigger braking gap than we're seeing here between the two props.